Hello, 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 hello. Happy tremendous Thursday, one and all. I'm starting a little bit early today, so if you're joining at 9, just go backwards and start listening from the beginning. I've got an appointment today, so I was trying to start a little bit earlier so I wouldn't be quite as rushed. Today we're going to be reading 2 chapters, chapter 10 and chapter 11. We left off, Edmund made it to the witch's house, and the witch was not happy to see him without his siblings. Did not offer him Turkish delight, and it left off with prepare the sledge and do the one without or remove the bells or something, which means she's going in stealth mode. She does not want to announce her presence. So Beavers and the kids are on the move to the stone table to hopefully get to Aslan. Aslan's going to hopefully help them battle the witch, try to get Edmund back. Very complicated. Also, I was just reviewing social studies tests yesterday. Most of you did very, very well. Nice job. As always, remember anything over 80% means you did fabulously, and I'm not concerned about you at all. I don't know about you, but I think it's fabulous that it gives you your immediate score when you're done, so you don't have to wait for Ms. Cummins to grade it. Speaking of grading, I graded 5 mission reports this morning. It was kind of a sprinkling from both classes. I just randomly picked one. So you might want to check your email, see if you got your mission report back today. I'm plugging away. It's a good thing I've been waking up early these days. I wake up before puppy and daughter so I can actually focus and get some mission reports done. Anyway, off we go. Chapter 10, the spell breaks. And today, hopefully we will not have any audio issues, so I don't have to record this twice. I'm going to keep my eye on the microphone and the green dot down at the bottom that shows that voice is being inputted into the system. All right, the spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except for Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham and here's a packet of tea. There's some sugar, some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "I'm packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said the wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "How long is quarter of an hour?" 15 minutes, and she's like not panicked. "But don't we want a big start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan, "and as soon as she looks in here and finds that we're gone, she'll be off top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we're going to be walking." "Then do we have no hope?" said Susan. "Now, don't you get fussing, there's a dear," said Miss Beaver. "But just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course, we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways that she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "Well, that's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking straight at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on, let's hurry," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Miss Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine is too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "a great deal too heavy, and don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose." "Oh, I just can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with my dear sewing machine," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it, as likely or not." "Oh, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said. And they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey, and they went in single file. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and then Mrs. Beaver was last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the riverbank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." So he's on this really narrow, tiny path, probably bumpy, that his sledge wouldn't be able to go on. So he knows, like, this is a safer spot for them. It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all, and she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river and the waterfalls of ice and at the white masses of the treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pat, 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 pat through the snow right in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more, and at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then, as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Now, I always tell my students, if you've ever been to Disneyland and you get there when it opens and you stay to the last possible midnight closing, whatever, I mean, you are exhausted. Your feet feel heavy. You just can't wait to get to the car. And this is kind of how Lucy feels. She's exhausted. Like, when are we going to stop? Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him, and then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we should be able to get a few hours' sleep at least." "If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows for us," said Miss Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought, just a hole in the ground, but it was dry and it was earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they all were a big bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really quite snug, if only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and splutter a little and stung their throat, but it almost made you feel decisively warm after you swallowed it. And everyone went straight to sleep. Pretty sure Mrs. Beaver passed around a sleeping potion. I don't think she wanted to hear the complaining. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though really it was hours and hours and hours, when she awoke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff and thinking how she would really like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, and they were listening to a sound which was the very sound that they'd all been thinking of and sometimes imagining that they heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was actually really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. Now, we had a clue, remember, when she said, "Prepare the sledge"? She said, "Prepare the one without the bells." So did she change her mind? We'll see. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 whole minutes, and then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh no," thought Lucy. "He's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little bit later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they're excited. I mean, in Narnia, in our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight and with earth all over them and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed and with the sleep still in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already starting to crumble." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she always made it winter, but never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, come and see." And then they were all at the top, and they did see. It was a sledge, and it was a reindeer with bells on their harness, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside of it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because though you see people of this sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them, and we hear them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it's rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly, but now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that at all. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She has kept me out for a long time, but I've got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness, which you only get if you're being solemn and very still. "And now," said Father Christmas, "for your presents. There is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it in your house as I pass by." If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy. "The house is all locked up," which makes me crack up. Santa, do locks do anything for him? "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home, you will find your dam finished and mended and all the leaks stopped and a new sluice gate fitted." Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide, and he found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents." Now you tell me what you think of Santa's presents. "They are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words, he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across it was ramped a big red lion, as bright as a ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was made out of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a pretty serious kind of present. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. "You must use this bow only in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss, and when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come help you. Last of all, Lucy, Eve's daughter." Lucy came forward, and he gave her a little bottle of what looked kind of like glass, but people said afterward it was made out of diamonds. And he gave her a small dagger. She's like 5. He just gave her a knife. "In this bottle, there's a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grows in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is only to defend yourself at great need, for you are also not to be in this battle." "Why, sir," said Lucy, I'm not sure, but I think I could be brave enough." "That is not the point," he said, "for battles are ugly when women fight. And now," here he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag that was on his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups, saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. Then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true king." And he cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge and all were out of sight before anyone realized that they had started. Now, when we do this in the classroom, when I read that line about battles are ugly when women fight, typically starts an interesting discussion because, as we know, there's women in the military now. And I personally would be terrible because I don't even know how to use any weapons. I'd probably be like whining and like, ugh. So I would be terrible. But there's some women who are tough as nails, just as tough as men, some even more tough than men. I always tell the story. My old neighbor, she was a jailer. She worked at a jail, and she was the one who like put people in their cells. I mean, she was one tough cookie. I mean, she'd be out doing her gardening instead of using like the cute little garden shears to cut her roses. She had a chainsaw and she'd just be like, so Allie, she would be great in the battle. Miss Cummins, not so much. So it talks about battles are ugly when women fight. This was a time when women were not allowed in the military. Nowadays, you know, some women do great at it. Some men do great at it. Some men don't do great at it, right? We all know what kind of is in us, right? So anyway, I think one of your questions today is about what does he mean by that? And do you agree or disagree with that statement? So just make sure you agree or disagree politely. Peter had just drawn his sword out of his sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand there talking till the tea's gotten cold, just like men. Come and help to carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing that bread knife. So down the steep bank they went and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some of the bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, time to be moving on now. Chapter 11. Hold on, let me check Marley. Marley, who was it? She's like flinging open the door. Hello, stranger danger. Let me go check real quick. Okay, I'll be right back. You did not just fling open the door, did you? Oh, okay. I was like, what is happening? Okay. False alarm. It's just the gardener trying to get in. My daughter's safe. It's exciting. All right, chapter 11. And now the dog's barking at the gardener. Aslan is nearer. Edmund, meanwhile, had been having a most disappointing time. When the dwarf had gone to get the sledge ready, he expected that the witch would start being nice to him, as she had been at their last meeting. But she said nothing at all, and when at last Edmund plucked up his courage to say, please, your majesty, could I have some Turkish delight? You said, she answered, silence, fool! Then she appeared to change her mind, and she said, and yet it will not do to have the brat fainting on the way. And once more she clapped her hands, and another dwarf appeared. Bring the human creature food and drink, she said. The dwarf went away and presently returned, bringing an iron bowl with some water in it and an iron plate with a hunk of dry bread on it. He grinned in a repulsive manner, so he's like, enjoy, as he set them down on the floor beside Edmund and said, Turkish delight for the little prince, ha, ha, ha. Take it away, said Edmund sulkily. I don't want dry bread. But the witch suddenly turned on him with such a terrible expression on her face that he apologized, and he began to nibble at the bread, though it was so stale he could hardly get it down. You may be glad enough of it before you taste bread again, said the witch. While he was still chewing away, the first dwarf came back and announced that the sledge was ready. The white witch rose and went out, ordering Edmund to go with her. The snow was again falling as they came into the courtyard, but she took no notice of that and made Edmund sit beside her on the sledge. But before they drove off, she called Mogram, and he came bounding down like an enormous dog to the side of the sledge. Take with you the swiftest of your wolves and go at once to the house of the beavers, said the witch, and kill whatever you find there. If they are already gone, then make all speed to the stone table, but do not be seen. Wait for me there in hiding. I, meanwhile, must go many miles to the west before I find a place where I can drive across the river. You may overtake these humans before they reach the stone table. You will know what to do if you find them. I hear and obey, O queen, growled the wolf. And immediately he shot away into the snow and darkness as quickly as a horse can gallop. Barking noises from Cleo, think of that as the wolf, except for a lot deeper and a lot scarier. In a few minutes, he called another wolf and was with him down on the dam and sniffing at the beavers' house, but of course they found it empty. It would have been a dreadful thing for the beavers and the children if the night had remained fine, for the wolves would then have been able to follow their trail, and 10 to 1 would have overtaken them before they got to the cave. But now that the snow had begun again, the scent was cold, and even the footprints were covered up. Meanwhile, the dwarf whipped up the reindeer, and the witch and Edmund drove out under the archway and on and away into the darkness and into the cold. There was a terrible journey for Edmund, who had no coat. Before they had been been going quarter of an hour. All the front of him was covered with snow. He soon stopped trying to shake it off because as quick as he did that, a lot more gathered, and he was soon very tired. Soon he was wet to the skin, and how miserable he was. It didn't look now as if the witch intended to make him a king at all. All the things he had said to make himself believe that she was good and kind and that her side was really the right side sounded so silly to him now. He would have given anything to meet the others at this moment, even Peter. The only way to comfort himself now was to try to believe that the whole thing was a dream and that he might wake up at any moment. And as they went on, hour after hour, it did come to seem like a bit of a dream. This lasted longer than I could describe, even if I wrote pages and pages and pages about it. But I will skip on to the time when the snow had stopped and the morning had come and they were racing along in the daylight. And still they went on and on with no sound but the everlasting swish of the snow and the creaking of the reindeer's harness. And then at last the witch said, "What have we here? Stop!" And they all did. How Edmund hoped she was going to say something about breakfast, but she had stopped for quite a different reason. A little way off at the foot of the tree sat a merry little party, a squirrel, his wife, and their children, and two satyrs, and a dwarf, and an old dog fox, all sitting on stools around a table. Edmund couldn't quite see what they were eating, but it smelled lovely, and there seemed to be decorations of holly, and he wasn't at all sure that he didn't see something like a plum pudding. At the moment when the sledge stopped, the fox, who was obviously the oldest person present, had just risen to its feet, holding a glass in its right paw as if it was going to say something. As if it was going to say something. So he's like, "Cheers!" And then he sees the witch and he's like, "Oh." But when the whole party saw the sledge stopping and who was in it, all the gaiety went out of their faces, and the father squirrel stopped eating with his fork halfway to his mouth, and one of the satyrs stopped with its fork actually in his mouth, and the baby squirrels all squeaked with terror. "What is the meaning of this?" asked the witch queen. Nobody answered. "Speak, vermin," she said again, "or do you want my dwarf to find you a tongue with his whip? What is the meaning of this gluttony, the waste, the self-indulgence? Where did you get all these things?" "Please, your majesty," said the fox, "we were given them, and if I may make so bold as to drink to your majesty's good health." "Who gave them to you?" said the witch. "Father Christmas," stammered the fox. "What?" roared the witch, springing from the sledge and taking a few strides nearer to the terrified animals. "He has not been here. He cannot have been here. How dare you? But no, say you have been lying, and you shall even now be forgiven." At that moment, one of the young squirrels lost its head completely. "He has! He has! He has!" it squeaked, beating its little spoon on the table. Edmund saw the witch bite her lips so hard that a drop of blood appeared on her white cheek. Then she raised her wand. "Oh, don't, please!" shouted Edmund. But even while he was shouting, she had waved her wand, and instantly, where the merry party had been, there were only statues of creatures, one with its stone fork fixed forever halfway into its stone mouth. Were seated around a stone table on which there were stone plates and stone plum pudding. "As for you," said the witch, giving Edmund a stunning blow on the face, as she remounted the sledge, "let that teach you to ask favor for spies and traitors. Drive on!" And Edmund, for the first time in the story, felt sorry for someone besides himself. It seemed so pitiful to think of those little stone figures sitting there all the silent days and all the dark nights, year after year, till the moss grew on them, and at last even their faces crumbled away. Now they were steadily racing on again, and soon Edmund noticed that the snow, which splashed against them as they rushed through it, was much wetter than it had been last night. And at the same time, he noticed that he was feeling much less cold. It also became foggy. In fact, every minute it was growing foggier and warmer, and the sledge was not running nearly as well as it had been running up until now. At first, he thought this was because the reindeer were tired, but soon he saw that couldn't be the real reason. The sledge jerked and skidded and kept on jolting as if it had been struck against the stones, and however the dwarf whipped the poor reindeer, the sledge went slower and slower. So basically the snow is not hard anymore, so they're trying to go through slush, and they're working so much harder, and they're going really slow. There also seemed to be a curious noise all around them, but the noise of their driving and jolting and the dwarf shouting at the reindeer prevented Edmund from hearing what it was. until suddenly the sledge stuck so fast that it wouldn't go on at all. When that happened, there was a moment's silence, and in that silence, Edmund could at last listen to the other noise properly. A strange, sweet, rustling, chattering noise, and yet not so strange, for he'd heard it before, if only he could remember where. Then all at once he did remember. It was the noise of running water. All around them, throughout the site, there were streams, chattering, murmuring, bubbling, splashing, and even roaring. And his heart gave a great leap, though he hardly really knew why, when he realized that the frost was over, and much nearer there was a drip, drip, drip from the branches on all the trees. And then as he looked at one tree, he saw a great load of snow slide off of it for the first time since he had entered Narnia. He saw the dark green of a fir tree, but he hadn't had time to listen or watch any longer, for the witch said, "Don't sit staring, you fool! Get out and help." And of course, Edmund had to obey. He stepped out into the snow, but it was really only slush by now, and he began helping the dwarf to get the sledge out of the muddy hole that it had gotten itself into. They got it out in the end, and by being very cruel to the reindeer, the dwarf managed to get it on the move again, and they drove just a little bit further. And now the snow was really melting in earnest, and patches of green grass were beginning to appear in every direction. Unless you have looked at a world of snow as long as Edmund had been looking at it, you will hardly be able to imagine what a relief those big green patches were after the endless white. Then the sledge stopped again. "It's no good, your majesty," said the dwarf. "We can't sledge in this thaw." "Then we must walk," said the witch. "We shall never overtake them walking," growled the dwarf, "not with the start they've got." "Are you my counselor or are you my slave?" said the witch. "Do as you're told. Tie the hands of the human creature behind it and keep hold of the end of the rope, and take your whip and cut the harness of the reindeer. They'll find their own way home." The dwarf obeyed, and in a few minutes Edmund found himself being forced to walk as fast as he could with his hands tied behind him. He kept on slipping in the slush and mud and wet grass, and every time he slipped, the dwarf gave him a curse word and sometimes a flick with his whip. The witch walked behind the dwarf and kept on saying, "Faster, faster!" Here's Edmund, the dwarf, and the witch. He's kind of tied up like a slave. Do you guys feel sorry for him? Meh. I have like this much. Every moment, the patches of green were growing bigger and the patches of snow were growing smaller. Every moment, more and more of the trees shook off their robes of snow. Soon, wherever you looked, instead of white shapes, you saw the dark green of firs or the black prickly branches of bare oaks and beeches and elms. Then the mist turned from white to gold and presently cleared away altogether. Shafts of delicious sunlight struck down onto the forest floor, and overhead you could see a blue sky popping through the treetops. Soon there were more wonderful things happening. Coming suddenly around a corner into a glade of silver birch trees, Edmund saw the ground covered in all directions with little yellow flowers. Celandines. The noise of water grew louder. Presently they actually crossed a stream, and beyond it they found snowdrops growing. "Mind your own business," said the dwarf when he saw that Edmund had turned his head to look at them, and he gave the rope a vicious jerk. But of course, this didn't prevent Edmund from seeing. Only 5 minutes later, he noticed a dozen crocuses growing around the foot of an old tree, gold and purple and white. Then came a sound even more delicious than the sound of water. Close beside the path they were following, a bird suddenly chirped from the branch of a tree. It was answered by the chuckle of another bird a little farther off. And then at that, as if been given a signal, there was chattering and chirping in every direction, and then a moment of full song. And within 5 minutes, the whole wood was ringing with birds' music. And wherever Edmund's eyes turned, he saw birds alighting on branches or sailing overhead or chasing one another or having the little quarrels or tidying up their feathers with their beaks. So basically, the author does a really good job of creating the image of the snow melting, the floor is thawing out, the birds are coming to life. So it's showing the power of the witch is diminishing and the power of the strength of Aslan is increasing. "Faster, faster," said the witch. There was no trace of the fog now. The sky became bluer and bluer, and now there were white clouds hurrying across it from time to time. In the wide glades there were primroses. A light breeze sprang up which scattered drops of moisture from the swaying branches and carried cool, delicious scents against the faces of the travelers. The trees began to come fully alive. The larches and the birches were covered with green, the laburnums with gold, and soon the beech trees had put forth their delicate, transparent leaves. As the travelers walked under them, the light also became green. A bee buzzed across their path. "This is no thaw," said the dwarf, suddenly stopping. "This is spring. What are we to do? Your winter has been destroyed, I tell you. This is Aslan's doing." "If either of you mentions that name again," said the witch, "he shall instantly be killed." Okay, so witch is Bitter Betty. She does not like this whole Aslan stuff, and Edmund realizes he definitely chose the wrong side. He's feeling remorse, but we'll see if he gets reunited with his siblings or not. The next chapter is called Peter's First Battle. So we have a war coming up. Also, I meant to tell you, I got an email from Gregory Moan, the author of Fish. I think it was last night. And he said he absolutely loves all the letters that he got. I guess he has a P.O. box that he visits every so often for his business, for his author business. And he said it was bursting at the seams, which is exactly what we wanted. And he said they were all so special, and he's going to hold on to them and do something special with them. And they meant a lot to him. So thank you to those of you who did send those letters. They were received, and mission accomplished. Okay, as always, you're going to jump in your reading response journal. Again, this is not to be mean. This is how you get the information to stick. 3 vocabulary words per chapter. Answer your questions. If there's true or false, you're going to fix it if it's false. If there is a written response short answer question, make sure you use evidence from the text to make sure that your voice has power to it. All right. This afternoon, 1 o'clock, I will see Miss Nogdave's class for social studies. The social studies chapter 8 packet is posted on Edlio. So if you don't have it printed out yet, now would be the time. What else? Yeah, so bring your textbook, your chapter review packet, and a pencil, and we will learn about new communication and technology, which won't seem like very cool technology to all of us, but back then, mind-blowing. All right, have a good morning. Talk to you later. Bye.